with Zoom. So welcome to panel 2. This panel is focused on applying medical AI. I'm Jill Lewis, a partner in the corporate section of Perkins Coie. Really enjoyed hearing about the investment aspect in medical AI in the last panel. And I am here with panelists who have worked to study and implement medical AI in clinical settings. We will discuss the practical, legal, and ethical challenges that must be confronted at this stage in the process. I'm here with Dr. Teodor Grantcharov. He is the professor of surgery at the University of Toronto, the Keenan Chair in Surgery at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, and inaugural director of the International Center for Surgical Safety at Unity Health Toronto. Welcome. We also have my colleague, Dean Harvey. He is a technology transactions partner and co-chair of the Perkins Coie AI and robotics practice. Next, Dr. Steve Miff, who is president and CEO of the Parkland Center for Clinical Innovation here in Dallas, Texas. We are also joined by Dr. Herbert, who is a faculty and chair of the Department of Surgery at UT Southwestern Medical Center. Welcome all. Continuing the themes from panel 1, we will explore the experience of implementation in clinical settings and what barriers confront clinicians, hospitals, and patients using AI. We will then move to a discussion of what should lawyers and policymakers know in this stage of implementation. I'd like to start off with one sort of a framing of the issue, and I would like for each of our panelists, and I will introduce them to be able to speak on this, but each of our panelists to be able to talk a little bit about how they are experiencing this in their unique backgrounds. So AI has now moved fully into the implementation stage, but has the law moved with it? Our panel will be able to discuss how their disciplines as clinicians and lawyers are helped or hindered by the state of play. So spoiler alert, the humans are still in charge. So I'd like to start with Dr. Miff. And if you could just share a little bit about your background in AI and how you have come to the implementation here.
No, good morning. This is such a relevant discussion, and I'm so excited to be part of this great group of innovators. I'm the president and CEO of PCCI, and we're actually celebrating our 10-year anniversary this year. And we've had the opportunity to partner with Parkland, with the local health plan, with the local community over the last 10 years, and actually experiment and build, test, deploy a variety of models within the clinical workflow. So we have over a dozen models that are actively deployed. And it's not just leveraging the clinical information, but also bringing in additional information that can enrich the data that we understand that person much better. So along this journey, we've certainly experienced a lot of challenges. Our successes have a lot of cuts and bruises along the way, and I'll be happy to share what we've learned, and also where we see things are at this point in its evolution.
So Dr. Zay, we'll walk across the street virtually as you are across from Parkland at UT Southwestern, and talk a little bit about in your arena how you all are experiencing the implementation of AI. And you're on mute.
As far into the pandemic, and it still happens. Yeah, so my own personal journey into AI really started with robotic surgery, which I started about a decade or more ago. And, you know, I give talks to many academic medical centers and surgery departments, and a lot of the interest initially in the robot was some of the increased dexterity and the 3D visualization that you could get with robotic surgery, which I think is all there and very true, and is a paradigm step above laparoscopic surgery. But it occurred to me after about 5 or 6 years of performing robotic surgery that the real disruptor of this technology was the ability of the computer to actually both measure and assist the surgeon and how they move in 3D space. So in other words, you know, that computer is not only tracking how the surgeon is moving, the entire time. It also has new algorithms that are helping assist the surgeon. When I operate robotically, I am completely ambidextrous. I can operate with the left or the right hand, which is not true open. In fact, it's gotten to the point I've spent so much time on the robot, and I'm an avatar. I'll ask sometimes during an open surgery for a needle driver in my left hand, and will get frustrated when my left hand doesn't do what I know that it can do with the robot. And it's an example of where surgery is going. And so in order to really take it to the next step, in terms of helping the engineers develop algorithms that will make surgery even safer and enhance, because right now most open surgery and laparoscopic surgery is still just on the motor cortex of the surgeon. We need to develop a lot more validation data. We need to understand better what's going on with that data. And then, Dr. Grantcharov will talk about how that surgeon moving in XYZ space behind that robot or computer assisted surgery, which is, I think, better, is not in a vacuum. There's lots of things going on around them that affect how that surgeon's performing.
Well, and that is a perfect segue to having Dr. Grantcharov comment on this, and in particular, bringing in a different jurisdiction, because you're in Canada and you have maybe faced some unique implementation issues in a different jurisdiction.
Yeah, thank you again for inviting me. It's a really exciting discussion, and obviously we're still, even though we've had access to technologies that will enable algorithms to make an impact in the way we practice surgery or practice medicine, there's still a lot of things that are still unclear. What are the requirements for validity? What are the requirements for explainability? And so on. So I probably I'm not the right person to cover some of the legal challenges in Canada versus US versus Europe. But we have some experience in all these three jurisdictions, because in addition to my job as a surgeon, I am a founder of a company, Surgical Safety Technologies, that created data capture platform in the operating room, and we've been using this data for more than 7 years now to generate various tools and analytic products that could help us deliver a better piece of work as surgeons, but also provide a safer environment for us as healthcare providers and for our patients. So I think it's important when we develop or implement any type of technology to remember what is the goal. In this case, AI is not the goal. Our goal is to continuously improve as surgeons, to continuously be coached and educated. But also another goal is to understand how we can deliver precise, predictable, high quality, super safe care to our patients. And that can be done through devices. It could be done through manual analysis of data. But AI can be a tremendous tool that could enable us to reach far more surgeons and healthcare providers and far more patients at the same time. We have to remember that when we when we develop and implement these algorithms, we need and we want to improve safety, we need to make sure that these tools and algorithms are safe, that they're well validated, that they're transparent, that they are explainable. And this is one of the main efforts that we've been engaged with. I don't feel that there is legal and all other ethical challenges or questions have been sufficiently addressed yet. I still feel that there are a ton of questions, ethical, legal, and performance-based, that need to be discussed, need to be shared, and we need to have a common understanding, regardless in which jurisdiction we practice or develop and implement these algorithms, that we adhere to certain standards that I feel in our field are still quite fluid.
Yes, and we will have an opportunity to kind of walk through that as well. I'd like to move over to Bean, who was definitely in practice for many years before much of this came to fruition. So he was able to really watch this area develop. Dean, can you talk a little bit about what you have seen and how you came to be involved in this space?
Sure. Well, actually, my undergrad was computer science, and my very first job after undergrad, way back in the Stone Age of AI, was developing expert systems. If you haven't heard of expert systems, they were the most overhyped and underperforming type of AI ever developed. But I did go on and spend 10 years in the industry before and doing law school. And today I advise tech clients, healthcare clients, and other clients on artificial intelligence implementation, development, and other issues at the intersection of law and technology. And I think Dr. Zay explained some of the benefits of AI, just a very small sampling of some of the potential benefits. Dr. Grantcharov noted, of course, the goal has to be the delivery of safe care. And I think in looking at that and looking at implementation, we have to understand the shortcomings of AI in order to address the legal and ethical questions that arise. So it's not that there's not vast potential to do good, but there are also risks and issues that have to be addressed. And I think, current machine learning technology has been accurately criticized as being greedy and brittle and opaque. It's greedy because it requires vast amounts of data in order to produce a predictive model. And this is particularly a problem in healthcare, where access to high quality labeled data is a significant barrier in the development and evaluation of AI algorithms for clinical decision making. And the process of developing that data requires really skilled labor going through patient charts to create meaningful labor. So it's not an easy problem to solve. The systems are brittle because when they're confronted with a scenario outside of the training data, the results are unpredictable. And obviously unpredictable results is inconsistent with a safe outcome. And so you have a very, very useful tool within a very narrow domain of knowledge, but as soon as you move outside of that narrow domain, the results become unpredictable. And then AI systems are also opaque, or some of them are opaque. They act as black boxes. And so to Dr. Grantcharov's comment about transparency and accountability, these are standards that have to be developed that are not developed either in healthcare or outside of healthcare currently. And of course, that failure in healthcare would be deeply, deeply concerning. And then finally, as Dr. Miff mentioned, the use of demographics in healthcare is really critical for some of these algorithms, but it comes with the risk if we're using data sets that reflect historic inequities of accidental inadvertent algorithmic bias, which of course, again, is going to be a harm that we need to prevent. So I want to emphasize, I do think that there is very, very significant potential to do great good, but we do have to address those shortcomings in both legal and ethical terms.
Yeah, and it's true with many technological developments and developments in real time. The law does not always neatly fill in what are the decisions, what are the standards, and how should those be evaluated. And the ability to really tack on to something as a standard is literally a moving target. I'd like to move to Dr. Miff as we talk about some of the institutional barriers that you may have to overcome to be able to implement this. PCCI was not always existent in Parkland, and living here in Dallas, knowing the microscope that Parkland is under, what were some of the issues that you faced in bringing about trust and credibility to this process?
Yeah, and Dean, I think, summarized them so well, and there are three key ones, and I'll give you a little bit of a glimpse of they haven't solved them, but how we try to address them. One has been the data access, in particular at the individual level. So while we've had fantastic data within the sandbox and ecosystem of Parkland, having broader access to data, because as Dean said, these models are thirsty for data, it's continuously a challenge. I think the second one has been the end user skepticism because of the newest nature of what we're trying to put out there, but also the need to actually provide transparency, not only how the models are built, but what's behind the models. And the third one has been the clinical decision usefulness and the integration of any type of model within workflows that the clinicians already using. So that the component, and alongside with that, I think it goes without saying, the ongoing maintenance, the retraining, the support of these models as well. So, to solve for some of these, I think the end user and clinician involvement from day one is so critical, because not only helps actually how to build the models, because oftentimes the clinicians know intuitively based on their clinical expertise what's important, but we want to take that knowledge and enrich it, enhance it, do it in scale using data. So how it's built, how it's trained, how it's intended to be used, how and where it should be integrated and displayed within the workflows for it to be useful. All of those things are critical to actually have the clinician or clinician teams as these ongoing active partners in this component. A great example of that has been we recently deployed a trauma mortality model at Parkland in collaboration with Dr. Starr and his team between UT Southwestern and Parkland. And initially it was a predictor score that displayed the likelihood of mortality, updated every 15 minutes, using all the EHR clinical data, but also social determinants of health. But what was extremely useful, what we quickly learned, that we're not also able to actually display what are the top 5 factors that are driving that score, and be able to display the data behind those factors in real time, so the clinician can see the score, but automatically can actually go and see what's contributing to that and what is the actual data that is at this point in time and historical. It just does not empower them to make those quick decisions that they need at the moment of care. So I think that's one of the other key component. The second one is the ability to study and compare model effectiveness, because there are multiple models coming into the marketplace, and whether we developed it or somebody else did, you want to pick the ones that are the best for the organization. So the ability to actually accurately and subjectively compare, and what is that an input that's required to evaluate, it's so critical. So those are the 2 things that I would highlight that we learned on this journey.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little more specifics of that. But before we go to Dr. Zay, I would like to also have you help our audience understand the difference between what we're talking about when we're talking about the models in PCCI and that data. And then when we go to Dr. Zay, talking a little bit about the application in robotics, because one is decision-making tool and the other has also sort of a dexterity piece to it, and an enhanced accuracy. So if you could talk a little bit about that, what are we talking about when we're talking about the PCCI systems?
Yeah, we're talking about really understanding the risk and the risk profile of an individual based on a specific disease or specific intervention that they're undergoing. So whether it's somebody that's at risk for pediatric asthma, or a pregnant mom that's at risk for preterm birth, or somebody that might be at risk for sepsis, is how do we bring all these relevant data together, apply AI or machine learning methods to be able to understand the risk level, the risk profile, and be able to tee that information up to the clinicians so they can proactively take action on those patients before their condition deteriorates to a point that requires more advanced intervention. So how do we actually use this, risk stratify, intervene early on individual patients?
Thank you. So Dr. Zay, as we're bringing on board and implementing surgical strategies using robotics, what are some of the hurdles that you have to overcome to be able to take that next technology actually into the OR?
Yeah, I guess where I'm mostly focused is around understanding safer surgery, as Teodor said, and what is probably a major component of that is how the surgeon performs. And so if you look at robotic devices where we have the potential to employ AI is in both training and credentialing. So That's someplace where we're starting now just to wade, but have a lot of both legal and ethical questions about that and validation, really. But the data, the greedy part of the data is there. As I mentioned, Intuitive, which is the main maker of these robots, has been collecting data for a long time. And we now, thanks to Dr. Grantcharov, have some algorithms that can look at the video. So we can get away from actually having to rely on Intuitive, which is the main maker of the robotics, which has not been very, let's say, collaborative with sharing that data. And so it's really understanding how surgeons move in XYZ space when you're ready to be called a novice and expert, and how that, what we know now is that how the surgeon actually performs, you can put a number on it, and it correlates to how the patient is going to actually do. There's actually a number of studies that both Dr. Grantcharov and I have published that based on human grading that have validated that. So now the next click back, well, if a human grader can do this, we know that the machine and the computer can do it. And can we now use that to start to really, like I said, both for training and credentialing, when are you ready to fly the Airbus 380 to France on your own, or when should you be, still in the little commuter plane?
So thank you. A lot is made of the differences in access in various healthcare systems. So, Dr. Grantcharov, could you talk a little bit about how your institution is experiencing this, and is it able to proliferate in the healthcare system in which you operate in Canada?
It's generally clinicians and hospitals are quite open to new technologies, and we're always exploring opportunities to engage in development of new technologies that will make us more efficient, may make us better at executing certain tasks, but also which will be hopefully associated with better clinical outcomes. So this first phase, kind of the honeymoon phase, where we develop new technologies, we see some initial validation, we celebrate some of these initial successes, need to be followed by, which usually the majority of the hospitals are open to this first phase, and clinicians are open to and want to explore, need to be followed by robust validation, and not only validation of the initial algorithm, but also continuous monitoring and auditing of the algorithm, ensuring that it's continuously valid, transparent, and explainable. And I think we didn't speak much about the explainability, because I really feel that in healthcare, this is critical. If we want clinicians and patients and to be engaged and trust these algorithms, they need to go outside the black box of the algorithm. They need to, if an algorithm determines that a surgeon is not ready to operate on patient, we need to understand why the algorithm made this assumption or this conclusion. Otherwise, the healthcare, the community, the surgical community will never accept an algorithm like that. That is no better than a subjective view of observer that could provide some feedback. So I think the first phase of initial excitement need to be followed by phase of robust validation and acceptance. And after that, we need the next phase will involve us addressing the massive ethical and legal challenges of deploying these algorithms, regardless of what jurisdiction these algorithms are deployed. So if we, for example, determine that a surgeon is good enough, not good enough to operate, or good enough to operate, we need to be ready to address the ethical and legal challenges of making this conclusion. Should this person continue to operate on patients and provide healthcare to them or not? And if not, we need to be able to address that in a legal way. If we make a decision that a patient deserves a different type of treatment based on the prediction of an algorithm, we need to be able to explain that. And again, the legal and ethical discussions that need to be, we need to go through in order to reach that phase where AI algorithms are mainstream and deployed in healthcare routinely. It's a discussion that is just beginning.
Well, that is a perfect segue to some commentary from Dean. You mentioned about explainability, and I think about, the principle of informed consent. But there were several other issues that you raised with respect to standardization, scoring, making determinations, and are those appealable? Dean, can you talk a little bit about some of the issues that Dr. Grantcharov raised and how you are seeing them in the law, both in contract and also playing out in the litigation realm?
Dr. Grantcharov has raised, of course, really, really fundamental and important issues to the ability to implement AI in healthcare. And I think if you step back and say, what is really the single biggest barrier to a broader adoption of AI in healthcare, I would have to say it is fundamentally the lack of guarantee, the lack of validation for any given algorithm as to its equitability, its safety, and its effectiveness in all potential use cases. Right now, and Dr. Zay raised one very important potential application, right? Robotic surgeons and the potential for validation and credentialing standards there, which are being developed. But those robotic surgeries have been going on for a very, very long time without any standard whatsoever being informed, or by hospital, really. A hospital might say you have to have 5 surgeries, practice surgeries, or another one, we see 50. There's no standard. So even though there is risk with having a validation standard, at least now we hopefully get more uniformity. There will be some errors, but there will be more uniformity and hopefully better improved safety overall. I think it's really important to understand that there are different buckets of the application of AI in healthcare. So there's one where AI algorithms are making suggestions to the clinician. That's probably the less risky because the clinician is still making all decisions and directly involved. Then there's the use for diagnostics. And the problem with diagnostics is right now, all the evidence supporting AI algorithm in diagnostics has been disseminated in the absence of any specific reporting guidelines for clinical trials involving AI modalities. There is no standard for those clinical trials involving AI modalities. So for stakeholders to step back and say, yes, it's explainable, yes, it's transparent, yes, it's going to meet our standards, there isn't really a standard for each study, so you can compare them study to study. And so when you have multiples, to Dr. Miff's point, how do you pick the best one? Because you can't truly, there's no standard for comparison of the actual diagnostic studies. So we have a lot of work to do. Again, I do see the benefits, and you hear about the work being done to establish standards for robotic surgery is critically important. I think we need to be establishing those same standards for clinical diagnostic trials involving AI, and there will be others that we will have to work through.
So one of the themes that has been touched on has to do with the reliability of the extrapolation or generalization of data across demographics. Dr. Miff, can you discuss the nature of the demographic information that's collected by your populations at Parkland, and what's the impact of that on your modeling? And if you've got some, for instances, I think, kind of a case study format would be interesting here.
Absolutely, and so we've been on this journey. We've been of strong belief that we need to understand an individual well beyond just their clinical needs. I think we've always done a great job understanding their clinical history, their clinical needs. But if we don't understand also not only their demographics and their ethnicity to understand some of the perspectives they bring, but really more about their life, we will not be able, at least the applications that we're working on, to really create not only those risk models, but also understand what are some of those barriers to access that we're encouraging or trying to enable them to do, and practically remove those. A concrete example has been, COVID. As the last 24 months now, one of the first things that we're asked to do in collaboration with Dallas County, the city of Dallas, park and other providers, is to build some algorithms to guide the actions as we're navigating through this. So initially, we built a proximity index that brought together multiple data sets around positivity rates, about individual patients, both to actually use algorithms to understand the risk of an individual based on how close they are to others that are actively infected and with how many. And tee that up in a way that also scanned through who had an appointment over the next 2 days, and if they're high risk, we're able to actually change those appointments proactively to virtual visits. But in that process, also tee up for those clinical teams that were changing the appointments, information about, is this individual likely to have food insecurity and challenges accessing medication? Because if we're asking them not to come in, and those are some of the things that we concurrently needed to provide. And then right at the heels of that, we also needed to really understand where and how are individuals and what the vulnerability to the disease, to COVID was, to be able to not only forecast what the impact of the different waves, but guide to where the deployment of, or the testing sites, or then the prioritization of vaccination could take place. And in developing that vulnerability, it was not just the profiles and the information about somebody's age, the medical comorbidities, but what really became important was their social determinants of health, and really understanding those life factors on, the housing situation, the type of work they had, because they became one of the leading predictors into that vulnerability. You add sort of mobility and how much people moving around, and you add the proximity to active cases, or to actually build something that's robust, that guided these specific action, and how do we reach those that needed to have it the most, in both a cultural sensitive way, whether we're trying to educate them, or position services where they can access them. One of the things that we learned during that process moving forward, that while we're able to assess the social determinants of health, even at that block level, using elements such as the Area Deprivation Index at the University of Wisconsin, to address those, we learned that you need to get much more granular and understand what is contributing to that overall index. So we ended up building some indexes, we call it the Community Vulnerability Compass, that gets to that block level, understands what are the characteristics that are contributing to that socioeconomic challenges, attribute those to an individual by geomapping, understanding the characteristics of the block based on where they live, and starting to use those and incorporate them into other models. So that's sort of what we've learned, what we try to do, and then how do we try to look at using that consistently and at scale moving forward.
Fascinating. So moving back to the world of robotic surgery and these procedures that are aided by AI. You mentioned, Dr. Zay, seeking standardization, the ability to rate a physician, and Dr. Grantcharov talked about this as well. Can we truly expect standardization is kind of my question one. And then question two, I was intrigued by your mention of your ambidextrous performance using robotics, and then feeling that frustration when in a freehand situation you don't do that. Is there a future where we will have surgeons who are rated for only robotics and surgeons who are rated for freehand?
That's a lot. I'll try to unpack some of that. So I do think that there are two advantages to computer-assisted surgery. The first is what you just mentioned, and probably that will continue to be baked in with the engineers as they come out with the next generation and the next generation, which is the algorithms that are actually facilitating the surgeon. In fact, there was a paper published a couple of weeks ago out of Hopkins where they did the first completely autonomous robotic surgery, where it sewed two pieces of bow together without the human actually. And that's probably where we'll get to. I mean, obviously, every commercial airline in the United States could be flown without a pilot now, but probably none of us would step on without a pilot. And surgery is certainly not there. So we will continue as the engineers get better at baking in those AIs. As far as, and then the next thing is sort of over the shoulder technology. Again, that goes along the same thing, you know, like a pilot, is there wind shear ahead? You know, can the computer machine learning algorithm learn to predict what's going on with the patient, like the weather, and warn the pilot rather than, you know, actually assist them. And then the last thing, which is you asked, which is the tougher question, which is standardization. It's not, I think we're looking more for thresholds, and what we're going to need to do is understand what are the minimum thresholds that are acceptable for certain outcomes. And so that is going to take us a while to develop, but we're not looking to make every surgeon the same, but we want to make sure that the thresholds, I think, unlike the airline industry, probably a not so secret in the surgery world, is that we don't currently have thresholds other than volume. How many of these cases have you done? You know, regardless of your outcome. So it's something that you know, I'm passionate about, because I don't want something like the FAA coming in and deciding who's going to fly the planes. I would rather our own community develop these standards. And as Dr. Miff pointed out, you know, we don't have any standards now that aren't just completely subjective, and we need to come up with something more objective.
Indeed, and it's why I've been on the fence on LASIK for many years, despite being quite blind, is you know, getting up that trust screen. So I want to, as we're moving into about the last 8 to 5 minutes, I want to make sure that if people have questions, they go ahead and put those in the chat as we move forward. Want to talk a little bit about what are the limits to the predictive value that is promised by the data that fuels AI? Dean, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I would say that there is no predictive value promised, right? So fundamentally what's happening is the data scientist is running a learner algorithm on the training data set. Until the predictive model is developed, there's really no way to tell whether the predictive model is going to work. You may not have enough data. The data may not be good data. The data may be biased. And so you have to develop the model to see if it works. And then all you're really doing, all the learner algorithm really doing, is finding correlations in the data. Those correlations have good predictive value, but correlation is not causation. And so we know that every machine learning model is going to fail. The data scientist can tell you how accurate it is. The data science cannot tell you when or why it will fail. And we know, faced with different context, that the results will be unpredictable. So we know there are significant limitations. That's the brittleness I mentioned of these models. So they do really, truly amazing things within their narrow domain of knowledge, but they don't move outside the narrow domain of knowledge, and they will fail. Now, they can still do things better than humans in some contexts. So even with that failure rate, it's still better than having a human do it. But we do have to understand that it will fail, which is why Dr. Grantcharov's comments about explainability, about transparency, about accountability are so important. You know, the other piece that I think Dr. Miff mentioned is including demographic data is critically important to health outcomes in some algorithms, but that risk of inadvertent discriminatory bias is very real. And I think we're probably all familiar with the algorithm used to predict kidney disease in the Boston area. One of the data features the data scientists used was the patient's spend on kidney disease. And I'm sure thinking, you know, the more spend would indicate a more severe disease. And they were using the algorithm to identify patients to go on the kidney transplant list. What they found was that patient spend was actually a proxy variable for race, and that African Americans spent very little despite the severity of the disease, and Caucasians spent a lot despite a less severe disease. And so using the algorithm resulted in African Americans who should have been placed on the transplant list not being placed on the transplant list. It's a very, very difficult problem to solve. And so it's one that, again, requires a lot of thought and a lot of process. There are techniques you can use, but right now, again, with no standardization, it is a very real risk, which is why explainability, transparency, and accountability becomes so critically important. So there is value here, but it is not 100% value.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is very important in your examples is making sure also that we're not conflating race and poverty. because these things dealing with spend are really about, a socioeconomic situation. And as we're looking at policy making around healthcare, et cetera, we've got to know that if there's this correlation between poverty and outcomes and their impacts on society, that we are building in the right constructs for that as well. So you also had mentioned, Dean, when we were chatting before, that there's still the duty of competence and how this will still fall to the human. Does this take some of the luster from AI, or is it something that we need to remember is always present?
Yeah, I don't think it takes any of the luster from AI. I do think that what it does is helps us understand that we're not at a point where we're going to have AI-enabled auto docs, robot doctors that are just going to be there without a clinician. The technology isn't anywhere close to that. And so if we set that aside and say, we can develop some truly amazing and useful tools subject to oversight by the clinician. The clinician needs to understand the risks, just like the clinician needs to understand the risks of the X-ray machine or any other useful tool that they are going to use. So there is a standard of care, duty of competence issue there, but it is a very useful tool. And the fact that there are risks shouldn't stop us from using it. What we need to do is put in place the safeguards to control those risks and still get the value.
Indeed. And you mentioned something about sort of the brittleness of models. I'd love to hear from Dr. Grantcharov and then Dr. Miff with respect to what has been your experience with the need for model retraining, dealing with model bias, variance, and noise in your outcomes? How have you been able to keep your AI functions moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we see that all the time. And we need to, anyone developing and implementing AI algorithm in healthcare or anywhere else need to be aware of this. Usually any model is developed on a data set once, and it's trained to perform to a certain standards on this data set. Once the model faces a different type of data, often it doesn't perform to the same standards. So we see that all the time for the models we develop in the operating room. When we first developed the model in our operating room in Toronto, and then we launched it in an operating room in Dallas with Dr. Zay, we found that it didn't perform initially to the same standard. So it required some fine tuning. That's why it's so important to be aware of this. It constantly monitor this performance and audit the output. Otherwise, we will inevitably face models that don't perform to the standards we expect them to. And in healthcare, our tolerance to some of these to the performance or error in performance is very critical. I think it's also important to be very open and transparent about our expectations. Often in healthcare, clinicians and patients expect 100%, which is not possible. And when we search on Google, it doesn't give us 100% predictability. It ranks some of this the search, and there are a bunch of other biases there that probably there will be necessary to do another conference about. But we need to be aware about the expectations. We need to establish certain standards. I need to be aware that once we achieve these standards in a data set, in a certain environment, in a certain patient population, a certain disease, and we're satisfied and the model faces something different, then we need to spend some time retraining. So we've established processes when we launch our models in a new OR, in a new healthcare system, in a new socioeconomic environment, because we have deployed our models in ORs in Canada, in the United States, in Western Europe, now in Eastern Europe, in highly functioning, well-funded academic hospitals versus remote community hospitals where access to technology and other sources are limited. So we need to be aware of all these factors, and we constantly need to be critical about the performance of this system, the way we are critical, the way we critically reflect on our own human performance and the performance of many other systems that we're used to operate.
Yeah, so we're coming up on time. So briefly, Dr. Miff, and then I'd like to just close with a quick statement from Dean on what we as lawyers and practitioners need to keep our eye on. Dr. Miff?
Yeah, I'll make two quick comments. One, we need to be humble enough to realize that all of this is a journey. You can't just build a model and, you know, throw it out there and everybody uses it, because with every application or evolution of the data sets or even a different application, you need to retrain, you need to study it to make sure that it reflects what you're trying to actually do. And what I'll add is also you constantly need to think about the clinical usefulness. Specific example is a model for inpatient sepsis to predict sepsis that we developed. And, you know, it was comparing to an EHR-based model. And when you looked just at the pure statistical model performance elements, the models are performing very identically. So, you know, number-wise, math-wise, they're both great. But when you actually looked at when the models actually fired, to inform the clinical teams, one was firing 23 hours before the antibiotics for sepsis were administered. The other one was actually firing on average an hour after. Well, you know, great, statistically they're performing the same, but if you're telling me an hour after already started antibiotics that the patient is likely going to have sepsis, you know, I'm not going to do much with it, versus do I have enough lead time? So the model actually gives me an information that I can study it and I can actually do something about it. The last thing that I want to mention, because sometimes we learn from mistakes, and something that Dean said, and I mentioned the COVID vaccination for proximity and vulnerability index. We need to really be careful if we apply any filters upstream of the data. Our experience was right when vaccines came, more demand than supply, decisions were made where let's prioritize those over the age of 75 because they are the most vulnerable. Well, guess what? When you look at Dallas geography or any other big city, life expectancy in some of the southern parts is 63. So do we automatically remove a whole group of individuals who actually needed probably these more than the rest just by applying an upstream filter in the decision of how do you actually do this? So I think, again, an example where you can correct it really quickly if you're on top of it, but you can introduce biases that you're not even anticipate if it's even in the model itself or how you actually use them.
Indeed. And Dean, if you could give us some comments on, kind of where you see the gaps in the law, where you see the law being, helpful, and what advice you would give to practitioners in this space.
I guess I'll start with advice to practitioners in this space. We talked about standards of care and duty of competence with respect to clinicians. And I think for every law student listening to us and every lawyer, we also have an ethical duty of competence. And in order to be able to advise our clients on the legal and ethical issues that arise that they're going to face with respect to artificial intelligence, we have a duty to understand the technology. If you don't understand the technology, you don't understand the facts, you cannot correctly apply the law, you cannot correctly assess the risks. We also have a duty to understand the industry and the regulatory framework, because these figure in terms of healthcare AI in ways that they don't in terms of AI in other areas. In terms of regulation, I'm very much a proponent of Dr. Zay's approach, which is, let's have the industry help to develop what we need rather than having some agency come in and impose a regulatory standard. This is still a nascent technology, and we don't want to stifle innovation. We do want safety. We don't want to stifle innovation. Are there things that could be done, I think, that would help from a regulatory perspective? I do. One thing, we've talked about the need for data. And obviously we have a privacy framework that is critically important. Trust is one of the foundations of modern medical ethics. But We need access to large sets of data, good data, labeled data, in order to be able to develop accurate algorithms. So there's a balancing that needs to occur there. And that's something that I think regulations could help with. I think if we look at the potential for inadvertent algorithmic bias, this is something that I think is very difficult to address, but one in which there are best practices and guidance on that would be helpful. And I think I already mentioned, having standards around clinical trials involving AI modalities so that they could be compared study to study would be very helpful in, again, determining what the best tools are. So that's at a very high level, but I do think there are real opportunities there.
Very helpful. And I want to go to Dr. Zay and to Dr. Grantcharov to talk a little bit about one of the aspects that is, pervasive in medicine, which is peer review. And so how pervasive is peer review in the AI space? And what are you seeing in that realm? I know you mentioned like your scoring system, but are people really evaluating that on, say, your committees around risk management or your committees around the practice in your hospitals?
I'll let you take that one first, Teodor.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry. Can you clarify the question a little bit? The peer review for around the systems that are being introduced, the AI systems.
Exactly.
How they're evaluated. Yes. So like anything else in healthcare, there are tremendous requirements for validity, reliability, and everything that we develop or should be or implement or will be implementing in clinical practice need to undergo a robust peer review process or scientific validation process. I think unlike many other areas where or in consumer where some product can reach the market just based on some marketing claims and so on, here in healthcare, I think there is absolutely no chance of a system like that reach widespread adoption if it hasn't undergone thorough scientific validation and a robust peer review process. That's I think anyone who wants to enter this space and wants to implement a system or on an algorithm or a product in this space needs to be aware that this will be without doubt challenged by the medical community. And I don't believe that any surgeon or clinician or many surgeons or clinicians today in 2022 will accept implementation of a product on their patients if it hasn't undergone a scientific validation.
Yeah, and we have a question from the audience on can you talk about any reluctance of surgeons and physicians to use these systems, and how are you overcoming that pushback? And I put that to all of the physicians on panel.
Maybe I can very briefly mention this. It is very connected to the question about peer review. I think there is no doubt we see reluctance, especially if we introduce some of these systems for some high stakes in some high stakes areas like certification or credentialing of surgeons or patient care. Surgeons and clinicians are reluctant to use those systems if they haven't been reviewed. And with the way we overcome this is through scientific validation.
Yeah, I would get back to what Dean said, though, which is if you look at the current way that we are doing peer review, which is subjective recall of what happened during the event versus the ability of some of these data collection systems that form the basis for the machine learning to really have an objective view of what went on, it's so much better. But we have to socialize it in such a way so that it's not threatening.
Jill, the only thing that I would add is transparency, thorough evaluation, and even when you not only Teodor made a great point about the peer review or other scientific studies, but even as you pass through those, I would say how do you deploy these is critical. So you deploy them in silent mode first, give enough time to actually see on your own real information and data, how it performs, be able to use that to really adjust, integrate at the point of care within those models before you actually jump both feet in and actually start to deploy real time. So you need to give yourself the discipline and the time to actually do this in a sequential way, even after you've passed all the rigor to understand the math behind it.
Yes. And, I remember when I first learned about some of the systems that were being deployed at Parkland, and it was explained to me as if you could have the benefit of 10,000 doctors' experience brought to bear in data for a physician to be able to make these determinations and for policy to be able to be developed. But when you think about all of these viewpoints, I also think a little bit about the role of diversity. Do we have a pipeline of women and people of color that you're seeing in your organizations to bring this forward? One, because of just raw numbers of needing to have more people in more communities, and two, because you're not necessarily getting all of the data that you could get in all the perspectives without having that. So could you speak to that a little bit, and particularly those of you in educational institutions? I know it's probably a focus.
The comments I made is that I don't believe, it depends on the applications, right? At least sort of the clinical care applications that we're involved in. You cannot really do it appropriately if you do not include race, ethnicity, if you do not actually understand some of those social economic challenges, because, and you cannot use a model that's been developed, for example, the Advocate Aurora in Chicago, or a model that was, developed in a market that serves mostly insured patients, and just take it face value and apply it the population that Parkland serves as an example. So that's like, the importance of incorporating these into the algorithms, understanding the makeup of the population, and retraining those models is critical before you even start considering what you're gonna use them. So I think, my point is you shouldn't even do it if you're not able to incorporate those elements into your algorithms.
And I see Dr. Grantcharov nodding.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think we also need to look at our goal to impact healthcare globally, not only in the US, not only in North America, but also in various socioeconomical conditions, because that's where we will save most lives. That's where the impact will be tremendous. That's how we can democratize surgery and healthcare, and our algorithms need to reflect the world. So addressing diversity, both gender, ethnicity, socioeconomical status, is one of the fundamental issues if we want to impact healthcare globally, which I believe all of us want.
There's as we develop, these AIs are all tools for us to use as physicians. And there's a famous story about surgical staplers, which are, very rudimentary tool, but we all use them, and they were designed really for a larger hand. And so as the workforce has become now greater than 50% women in some places, the staplers are not able to be used as facile if you have a smaller hand. So these are examples of historically where that bias is, and we can't let that repeat as we develop these new tools.
Indeed, indeed. So we do have one last question. I'll pose this one to Dean. From a medical malpractice perspective, is the use of AI something that gives the physician cover in the event of an adverse outcome, or is the brittleness of the system really a landmine?
So I'll start by assuring all the doctors on the panel I am not a medical malpractice attorney. So this is not my area of expertise. And so I'm probably going beyond my area of competence, but my understanding of med mal is essentially it is that a patient has suffered a preventable injury. And of course, one thing that a physician accused of medical malpractice can rely on is the standard of care, if you're following the standard of care. And I think this is why Dr. Grantcharov has been so emphatic that without scientific peer review, without validation, these technologies are not going to be adopted, because how else do you show then whether an injury was preventable or not when you're using this tool? So I would not say that using it is a cover. I think it emphasizes the need to develop those standards of care and to have that scientific peer review and validation of the technologies before they're used.
Wonderful. Well, we have reached time. The humans are still in charge. I really want to thank each of you. This panel has been excellent. I think we probably had another hour's worth of content that we could have gone through, but really appreciate, one, your flexibility in our pivot to virtual and the content you shared. And thank you for what you're doing in the profession. We will all be beneficiaries. So thanks.